something that, there was a lot of debate about the economic effects that it had. It was one of the reasons why the UK economy's GDP in the second quarter wasn't as strong as many had been expected. That was a hit to growth there. But we should expect one national holiday. That's also a day the markets will be closed here in the UK. But those details still will have to be announced by the government because it's them, I suppose, that has the power to do it.
And of course, as we approach 3 p.m., the New York Stock Exchange will observe a 1-minute moment of silence at 3 p.m. Wall Street time, of course, to honor the life and the service of Queen Elizabeth II. And Stephen, as we look ahead to the state funeral, I mean, just judging by the turnout from her Jubilee back just a few months ago, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, how big of an event are we anticipating here?
Absolutely massive, and that's why there has been a plan in place for such a long time for this event. We should expect large parts of central London will be closed to traffic, hundreds of thousands of people on the street, as you say. There have been these royal events in the past, happier royal events, we should say, the Jubilee celebration, the Platinum Jubilee celebration, that have brought hundreds of thousands of people out onto the street. Think about the crowds we saw for the royal weddings and all of those people that wanted to be out and be part of it and were camped out from early in the morning. This will be something that we should expect to see the country slow down, take a pause, and people to participate in. And there will be many, many people who will want to be not only on the streets of London, but in Windsor Castle, I'm sure at Balmoral as well, to pay their respects to somebody who's been such a large part of their lives here.
Stephen, I want to ask you simply about the British royal family and Queen Elizabeth's kind of role in that relative to the other royal families of Europe. You've seen it in Spain, you've seen it in, I want to say, Italy as well, the Italian family that really doesn't have much to do with politics. And of course, the other major European families, the other one that comes to mind is the Dutch royal family as well. But really, it was seen as the British royal family having far more precedence on the continent simply because of Queen Elizabeth. They were the most in the spotlight. What does that do to the concept of royal families here in Europe?
Well, it's really interesting because the transition in monarchies has been much greater in other parts of Europe. As you mentioned, after World War II, many of those monarchies were dramatically scaled back, not only their powers, but also their role in society. I mean, there's that, that story about the Dutch king as a trained KLM pilot who flies quite regularly for the national airline.
That's amazing.
I don't know if we'll see necessarily Charles training to be a British Airways pilot, but you never know. The continuity of the Queen has kept the monarchy in the state that it has been for such a long time. There may be changes on the way, but remember that a lot of the changes that happened elsewhere were because of events post-World War II, for example, big constitutional changes that were happening in many parts of the continent as well. So I wouldn't expect anything dramatic in the short term. And again, this will now be up to Charles he will be the defender of the monarchy, but also he will be its greatest advocate, and it will be his style that will dictate what happens next, and public opinion supporting him or not, as the case may be.
Hey, Stephen, we have about 30 seconds left with you. Then I know you have to go. It's close to 8 p.m. where you are. We really appreciate you taking the time and joining us this evening, this afternoon. Your final thoughts?
This is a momentous occasion. It is a quiet moment now. I can see the Shard in London, one of the landmarks, out my window, and the purple colour for the colour of royalty lighting up the top of the Shard here in London this evening. So this is a moment of reflection. It's a moment of great change. It is a tired phrase. It is the end of an era. We were told that the Winston Churchill's funeral was going to be something that was the requiem for Britain as a great power. The funeral for the Queen, I think, will be something even bigger.
That's Stephen Carroll joining us live from London. He's of Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Stephen, we really appreciate you taking the time and joining us on a day that nobody listening will soon forget. Stephen Carroll live from London. Well, it's 3 o'clock right now when we go to the New York Stock Exchange because it is taking a moment of silence right now to commemorate the Queen. the New York Stock Exchange right now observing a 1-minute moment of silence that began at 3 o'clock Wall Street time to honor the life and service of Queen Elizabeth II. This is very notable. I spent years working from the New York Stock Exchange, and I don't recall one time during the trading day where we stopped. Traders on the floor stopped and took a moment of silence. Oftentimes, we would honor the lives and legacies of people before the market closed, Katie, but I don't recall a time when I ever was there during the day of trading when everyone just stopped to honor a life and legacy.
It's rare for a reason, and today's events obviously rise to that level. The passing of the longest-serving monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, ascending the throne in 1952. It's just remarkable to think of what she lived through: world wars, recessions, a pandemic just recently in the past 5 years. And Tim, I think it's wild to remember that she unexpectedly became the heir apparent at age 10. This wasn't necessarily supposed to happen, but you remember her uncle abdicated the throne. He gave up the crown, of course, we're talking about Edward, so he could marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, and Elizabeth's father, of course, Prince Albert, reluctantly became King George. So an unexpected turn of events that just led to so much history, Tim.
You are listening to special coverage of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. We want to welcome all of our listeners who are listening right now around the world, online, at Bloomberg.com, on SiriusXM, and joining us from Boston, 106.1 on Bay State Radio. Kriti Gupta, markets correspondent for Bloomberg, is with Katie Greifeld and me right now. Filling in for Carol Massar this afternoon is Katie Greifeld. Kriti, I want to go to you because as you are a self-described Anglophile, as we've been covering this for the last 90 minutes, what has really stuck out to you?
You know, I think it's still what a drastic impact this is going to make on the thinking of Brits. And I love that you introed me as an Anglophile. I'll also add I did my thesis on the royal family back in college.
Did you really?
Well, one of my theses.
Wow.
Yeah, I was a history major, and you know the obsession dates to back then.
We got to get you a transfer to the London bureau.
Oh, one day, man, that's the dream. You know, I think what's so striking here is any Brit you talk to, and we heard it really in the voice of Kitty Donaldson earlier, and of course John Authers on Bloomberg Television earlier, is that she is the matriarch. She has been the matriarch for years and years on end, decades from, as Katie mentioned, world wars, recessions, the coal miners' strike of the 80s. She has been able to maintain her composure, maintain her neutrality in a way that I want to say a lot of other royal families in Europe, or ex-royal families, I should say, have not. She has been a leader in a time, especially most notably, stepping up to the plate ultimately when it came to the tragic death of Princess Diana. I think a lot of people, at least in my generation, remember her for that. But of course, she's had tough times. She's had to adapt over 70 years. I mean, there are people now, and I say this jokingly, there are people now who can't even adapt to new technology. She had to adapt an entire country's thinking, and I think that's what really stands out to me. The introduction of television during her lifetime, the introduction of what a marriage stands for, when a divorce is really justified, things like that, really adapting to modernity. I think she deserves a lot of credit for that.
I want to bring back in Stephen Carroll from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. We're not letting him go to sleep just yet, even though he has a very, very early show to get ready for. Stephen, I can't stop thinking about our conversation with Kitty Donaldson, Bloomberg News UK political editor, who joined us just a few moments ago. The way she spoke about her relationship with the Queen, and when I use the word relationship, I don't mean a personal relationship, of course. I mean growing up and seeing in the 1980s that there was a female prime minister with Margaret Thatcher. There was a female head of state with the Queen. That 85% of the population has never known anyone but the Queen. Hearing from Kitty, it's almost like hearing from somebody who knew the Queen intimately. And I'm wondering if you can explain that feeling across the United Kingdom that so many people have in a connection to the Queen.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kitty put it wonderfully, and I don't think I could express it in the same way as her. But think about that constant in life, and someone who, because they never spoke publicly, they were never controversial. I mean, there were some moments, obviously, you know, where she did face criticism, But you know, more often than not, she was a figure of celebration. You had national celebrations of her time on the throne. People threw street parties. It was just someone to rally around in a positive way, and that's kind of the real wonderful thing about, you know, I'm not from this country, and when I moved here and trying to learn about the love that people have for the Queen is fascinating, and yet totally understandable when you see the role that she plays in society as a constant, as someone that represents the nation, as someone that speaks. You know, the Queen's speech on Christmas Day, you know, which is televised at 3 p.m. You know, I don't know if my mother is listening, but I can tell you my mother, who was also Irish, also used to watch the Queen's speech at 3 p.m. on Christmas Day. It was an event that is so part of so many people's lives, and she was that constant that played a part in so many elements that people, you know, she would have been there, births, deaths, and across so much more that would have happened through people's lives. And she was that constant. And because she was above reproach, if you like, but because she played this very calm and sincere role, she provided a symbol and in a very unstable time. You know, if you think about everything that's happened over the past 70 years, and even in the past 15 and 20 years in this country, to have somebody in that position that was above the fray of politics and yet playing such an important role representing the country, it sort of gives an idea as to why this image has been created. And it was something that she played very well, and the reason that she was so loved and will continue to be remembered for that.
And Stephen, you talk about Queen Elizabeth as a constant, which she absolutely was. And if you think about the number of people living in Commonwealth countries right now, I think it's about 2.5 billion people. But talk to us about this largely peaceful sort of breakup of the British monarchy countries that we saw, because you think about how widespread the British monarchy once was. It really, she had to oversee sort of that being whittled down and broken apart in a peaceful manner, and to the point we've been making over and over again for the past hour, without actually letting us know what her personal opinion was.
Yeah, I mean, the end of the British Empire is something that, you know, there are lots of opinions on how it played out, and although it was different to the wars that we saw played out in other places, it wasn't an entirely peaceful dissolution, and it wasn't something that was, you know, universally passed off easily for everyone. I'm not an expert on that, and I wouldn't feel comfortable and characterizing it beyond saying that it was something that was not as simple as people have painted it to be over time. But it is true through all of that the Queen stayed the head of the Commonwealth organisation, was this important figure, a head of state for 15 countries, still a figure that was played such a unifying role and was able to play that symbol of representing without being controversial, because she was above the fray of day-to-day politics, and again that role played in cultural events, the celebrations that would have been had, her role in being, you know, opening state events as she so often did. This is, you know, something that is so difficult to replicate elsewhere in the world, and will be a huge challenge for Charles to take on.
I want to bring in our colleague John Authers, who's with us right now in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. John, it's good to have you with us. You spent, 30 years of your life in the UK. It's where you were born.
Yeah.
I heard you on Bloomberg TV a little earlier, and I thought it was really poignant what you said, that you're in your mid-50s and this is the only Queen you've ever known.
Yes. She's been a total constant of British life. You could dismiss her as just being part of the furniture, part of the woodwork, but she has always been somewhat more than that. You still, for example, every Christmas Day, she talks to the nation, and people do tend to watch. The fascination with the rest of her family remains intense, and we just need to look at how people are feeling at the moment. I'm looking at pictures of the crowds forming outside Buckingham Palace. The BBC, as I understand it, has gone dark. There will be no Premier League football this coming Saturday, and so on. This is very big. Whatever her actual role, practical role in the affairs of the nation became, her ability to be a figurehead or a reassurance of some kind of continuity, that this is how Britain most directly differs from the states, that it doesn't have a constitution, that there are just ideas and institutions that survive and can change slightly to tack with the times. And in many ways, the way she went about the role enabled the kind of things that have happened. She came to power a decade before the Beatles, so help us. I mean, the kind of things that went through society while she was queen. Amazing, it's in the past tense. It becomes much easier for a country to survive without clear written rules, without a clear constitution, if you have got that kind of clear-cut respect for a leader. And this is the other thing. I cannot construct any kind of a defense for still having a hereditary monarchy in this day and age. A modern democratic country just shouldn't have such a thing. But I have always been prepared to accept that if you were to put the existence of the monarchy in Britain to a referendum, like in Brexit, it's been obvious that she would win hugely, that she absolutely has had the consent of the governed. What concerns me, not because I am happy that we do have a monarchy, it's just how we would... The chance that the monarchy could be asked to leave now becomes real. And that is... that makes the whole British way of operating far harder to keep going.
Well, John, to that point, and we're talking to John Authers. He is a senior editor for markets and a Bloomberg opinion columnist. How does Prince Charles, now King Charles, sort of win the people's vote here? Is that possible in your view?
You never know. There were times, most obviously when Lady Diana, Princess Diana, as she was when she died, most obviously when Princess Diana died, when it did appear that the popularity of the monarchy and particularly of Charles was irretrievably damaged. In the case of the Queen, who I was in New York when this happened. I couldn't believe what was going on back home, that people were getting very angry with the Queen for not coming back down to London, for not showing she cared, for not talking to the people.
It was days, right?
It was 5 days. The thing I always felt rather sorry for was that she was up in Balmoral, where she died today, with Harry and William. And she's a grandmother, and she has with her grandchildren whose mum has just died in a car accident. Is it really suggest that she's an inhuman, terrible person that she stayed in Balmoral with her bereaved grandsons rather than coming and sitting in a TV studio in London? So at that point, that really struck me as a strong and fundamentally irrational move against the monarchy, a sense that that people really had enough of Queen Elizabeth, and she came back. By the time we had the 50th, 60th, and 70th Jubilees, she was hugely popular. They really mattered.
Well, Stephen Carroll is still joining us from London. Stephen, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, in how her popularity shifted really over the last 30 years. Exactly what we just heard from John Authers.
Yeah, well, I mean, that whole incident around the death of Princess Diana, I think, was a very difficult moment for the Queen and really put a question mark over her popularity. It took her a long time to move on from that. But we have seen, towards the end now of her life, as we were talking about it, the public celebrations of her Jubilee, her Platinum Jubilee, most recently in June of this year, there were still the street parties, there were still the people who were out celebrating. The slang around London was people were referring to Platty Jubes, the long weekend that everyone had off because of the Queen, and you heard, I mean, potentially ironically, but I think in a lot of cases quite seriously, people, talking a lot about the Queen that weekend, cheersing to her in pubs, etc. This is the goodwill that had been built up over her long reign, despite stumbles at times like John mentioned there. she managed to maintain a place in society which I don't think will be easily replicated, and I don't think exists in the same form in many other places in the world.
It's really a lot to digest, to talk about. I mean, I really can't even think of another figure who would possibly be in her category, maybe outside of Queen Victoria, her predecessor, and the kind of maybe tough start that she had in her career. Well, I want to say in her ascension to the throne. A very similar story, right, John?
Very young and had been born not expecting to become the monarch.
Exactly, and I think that's a key piece of the equation that our American listeners should be particularly aware of, is that Queen Elizabeth, she was not supposed to be queen. This was really, as I was just watching Christiane Amanpour's brilliant coverage over at CNN, and as she was supposed to put it, she was the accidental queen, really as a result of a American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. Talk to us a little bit about what kind of, what league would you put her in? If you had to compare, or had to, I mean, I really can't, is why I'm asking you this. I mean, someone else of her stature, someone else of her kind of accomplishments, to me, the only name that comes to mind is Queen Victoria.
In terms of British history, there's also Elizabeth I.
Yeah, that's fair.
Who was probably the most universally highly regarded, with good reasons, of the monarchs at the point when the monarchs really did exercise a lot of power. In terms of somebody who really embodied the country, or who had that kind of a powerful figurehead role for the nation, yes, it's Victoria. There's nobody else.
Yeah.
What was perhaps interesting is that because she has been so much something that, I don't know that we took her for granted, but we always knew she was there.
Right.
Like the BBC did a poll on who were the greatest Britons of the 20th century in 1999, and they didn't mention her. And Lady Diana, very controversially, came in a narrow second to Winston Churchill, who had only recently been killed and died at that point. So there's been a sense that she's almost so far above the fray that you don't really have that great an appreciation for what she's done. And I think one other point that does need to be made more clearly, that others isn't being made so much thus far. It's not just about the Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee, which led to her uncle abdicating the throne. The reason the British establishment really didn't want him there was because they knew he was a dissolute guy who really liked Adolf Hitler. And we do now know that Edward was very interested in being Hitler's puppet monarch, if they had. Wow. And this was, a very, very low moment for the British monarchy, obviously. Yeah. And a couple of years ago, somebody found a photograph where, in Balmoral again, where Edward, who is at that point, I think, the Prince of Wales, is teaching Elizabeth how to do a Nazi salute, which is a very, very sinister thing to see.
I'll add that was a concern that came with Prince Philip's extended family as well. If I remember, his, I want to say his sisters or his cousins had ties back to Nazi Germany, and it became an issue of how much content him and his uncle, who at the time was, I believe, the Viceroy of India at the time.
Last Governor General, I think.
Right,
was.
exactly.
But,
so when independence happened.
Louis Mountbatten, yes.
I want to jump in here because I know our colleague in London, Stephen Carroll, for Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, has to run. Stephen, we're grateful for the hour and 20 minutes that you spent with us, the almost 2 hours that you've been staying up. Give us your final thoughts before we let you go.
Look, it's night has fallen in London. I'm looking at the Shard out my window, and it is lit up in purple for Queen Elizabeth, and this will be the start of the 10 days of process that we are expecting to come now with national mourning. Will be the start of what I think it's fair to say Britain does best, which are big state events. We will see some of the best things that this country does in the way that they honour their queen, this woman who's been this symbol of 70 years on the throne, who went from the most difficult periods for this country, but also the most joyful, hosting the London Olympics, the Commonwealth Games. Of course, tribute was played to her at the start of that as well, just recently this summer. And even her Platinum Jubilee appearing in a video with Paddington. I mean, I think there are moments where of cultural iconography that can be attached to the Queen, as well as all of the importance and state work she did as well. And she will be remembered for both.
That's Stephen Carroll joining us live from London. Catch Stephen on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. You can listen to more of his coverage. It starts at 1 a.m. Wall Street time. That's 6 a.m. in London. John Authers, senior editor here at Bloomberg, also of Bloomberg Opinion. Before we let you go, I know you've been reflecting on this all day.
Yeah.
Give us your final thoughts.
My final thoughts. The presiding sense is of an ongoing unreality and a concern about what will happen next. The Queen, we now have the King. Queen Elizabeth was very small c conservative about exercising her powers. She stood back more than she absolutely had to, let various Labour governments take over and do some pretty radical things. And you did see, bearing in mind that we've also got a new Prime Minister this week, an amazing combination of events. You did see Boris Johnson really did stretch the Constitution and the role of the monarch to the limit. This is 3 years ago now. There was another bunch of people flew up to Balmoral to get her to sign off on allowing the Parliament to close down for 30 days, which was an utter constitutional outrage. I'm disgusted. But then again, how do you have a constitutional outrage in a country that doesn't have a constitution? The Queen, the fact that that is such an unusual event and that people objected so strongly to the use of the abuse of the Queen and the sense that what they had tried to do there, it wasn't just, you shouldn't do this, this is a nasty thing to do, it's you are abusing the Queen, is a very strong argument. And Boris won an election shortly afterwards, but he wasn't allowed to close down Parliament for a month. I'm concerned that Charles, for reasons that are partly his fault, i.e. the messy private life which people know about, and partly not his fault, he's had to wait 70 years to do the job he was born to do, which is a tough situation for him. He's tried to make a role for himself in different ways, becoming the country's most prominent architecture critic, that kind of thing. He isn't able to be above the fray. He may well be seen as trying to interject himself if he actually uses monarchical privilege in an appropriate way. So in terms of Britain's weird but ultimately successful constitutional order, this is a somewhat perilous moment, particularly because Scotland, the fact that the Queen was born in Scotland, loved Scotland, spent much of her time there. Scotland is interested in leaving the UK. The whole position of Northern Ireland has been cast into question following Brexit and the deals that Boris did over that. This does heighten my sense of concern about exactly where the country goes next. Because if we don't have the monarchy, trying to work out what we would have instead when we don't have a constitution to show, to give the rules of how we would make that decision is going to be make Brexit look like a tea party. So that's my a tea party in the British sense of a tea party in the garden at Buckingham Palace, not in the American sense of it. But that's my concern. That's my greatest concern. Is it's not just this sort of Freudian sense of our mother, the nation's mother is gone. There is also the sense that I don't think Charles or William really have the ability to be so far above the fray and regarded as so authoritative and with such respect that they can make this constitutional order work.
John Authers, senior editor for markets and a Bloomberg opinion columnist, giving us lots to reflect on, lots to think about, John. Really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. Well, we do have a little more than a half hour to go until the markets close here in the United States. Our focus of the program this afternoon has been on the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth. But I do want to get over to Kriti Gupta, who has been keeping a close eye on the markets, and get an update on not just what's happening on Wall Street, but what we saw throughout the world.
Yeah, and you know, what you're going to see is perhaps some disruption throughout the next 10 days. Of course, we are seeing a weaker pound that I will say was something that was in play before the really tragic news of Queen Elizabeth II. Let's talk about the next 10 days. We've talked about the procedure. We've talked about the funeral kind of process. I want to talk to you a little bit about the immediate consequences when it comes for the markets and for the economy, I might add. This coming from Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy. He put out a note talking about immediate consequences, and one of them, and I think this is arguably the most significant, is what happens with UK Parliament. It adjourns for potentially as many as 10 days, ending with the state funeral, of course. What that means at a time when the UK is really dealing with some pretty significant energy crisis. Remember, 150 million UK pounds worth of subsidies essentially is part of Liz Truss's new economic plan to freeze those energy prices for 2 years. That would actually delay the rollout of this. And remember, that is something that's actively being priced in when it comes to the Bank of England decision next week as well. How much help can the fiscal response really give to the monetary response, which, speaking of, September 15th, the BOE has a new monetary policy statement that could actually as well be postponed, just depending on what we hear. And the last one I'll add is the London Stock Exchange. We'll see if they pay some sort of tribute, if they put things on pause, and if you see any kind of other tributes from, say, even the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, and that, of course, would follow, like you mentioned, the New York Stock Exchange holding that moment of silence at 3 p.m. on Wall Street. Joining us now on the phone from London, I'm thrilled to say, is Stephanie Flanders. She is Senior Executive Editor for Economics and Government. Again, joining us on the phone from London. Stephanie, really great to talk with you. And as we've been discussing over the past 90 minutes, I mean, what a moment of change for the UK. A new monarch, a new prime minister with big plans when it comes to cutting taxes, supply side reforms to drive growth. Again, coming in a period of now political turmoil. How do you expect this to impact the sort of trajectory of the British economy, again, dealing with very, very high inflation?
I mean, you heard it highlighted there. There's certainly a danger, a worry that after quite a long hiatus, while we waited for the members of the British Conservative Party to elect Liz Truss as their new leader, and then she automatically became Prime Minister, we've had a whole summer waiting for that to happen, while this energy crisis was hitting everybody on the coming through their letterbox, their increased bills for their energy, and you were seeing it every day in the supermarkets, the rising cost of food and other things. So the very short-term thought is that to have another delay in the rescue plan and the big money plan that Liz Truss announced today was obviously not good news either for the pound or certainly for the economy and British households. But I think there's obviously a more fundamental concern that we have this moment of inflection for the UK, that change of monarch, someone who most people have never known any other, most people here have never known any other monarch, and a leader, a new prime minister that probably has the sort of weakest base to rely on, if I put it that way. You often find after a party's been in power for quite a long time that the last few years, they haven't had that period of renewal that comes from being in opposition. They have perhaps, already gone through the sort of first few layers of their talent. She has less support even from the Conservative Party members than Boris Johnson and his predecessor when they were elected by the party, and that was just 160,000 members of the party, not 70 million plus population of voters. So she was already in a fragile position, and then to have the country rocked by this and this one source of unity taken away, she's appointed a cabinet again that's very close to her, not necessarily the people who reflect kind of mainstream opinion in the Conservative Party, let alone the public. So I think it is a dangerous time, and you've already had seen that reflected in the way the pound has weakened over the last few months.
Stephanie, Tim Stenovec here. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon here, this evening there. Before we talk further, I just want to hear what it's like for you in London right now, what conversations you've had with friends, with loved ones, and just the way that you're reflecting on a day like today.
Yeah, it is one of those things, and I think we all had a little hint of it as we had those happy celebrations of the Platinum Jubilee. That I think many of, certainly in my case, I felt like I'd sort of really considered for the first time, oh, I'm going to be really sad when the Queen dies, which I know sounds ridiculous, but you know, we had this kind of childish belief that she would always be there, and I think everyone did sort of catch their breath. And as I was saying before, you know, it comes at a particular time where you think, gosh, this as well. You know, there's a sort of sense in your, I don't know, you have almost a feeling that this is a little thread that's going to be pulled out of the sweater of the British United Kingdom, and the whole thing could just fall apart. I hope that's not the case. But there is a feeling that she was this sort of one source of unity. So I think, you know, that's what's been reflected. Even my teenage children who, you know, find it very odd that she's died. They have a kind of different feeling about her probably than I do. I don't consider myself someone who's been particularly interested or focused on the monarchy, but she's this solid point, and for many people also the person that links you to your family, and people, you know, your mother and your grandmother who've long gone, you know, they too lived with her as queen. So I think for everybody there's a sort of personal family remembrance that comes with it as well.
And Stephanie, we were just talking about this with John Authors, sort of the popularity of the monarchy, the fact that Queen Elizabeth went through these ebbs and flows in her own popularity, and you know, ultimately ended her 70 years on the throne as a very, very beloved figure. But when you think about the future of the monarchy and the relevance of the monarchy, in your view, does King Charles, is he able to further that, or does the monarchy's relevance and popularity fade?
I think inevitably it fades. I think it has one of the great services. You know, it was often felt that you know, there was always jokes about Prince Charles being frustrated at the Queen sort of still blocking the seat. But actually, I think she did him a great service, because had he become king 20 years ago, there was a lot of mixed feelings about him, and obviously all of his divorce and the feelings about Princess Diana. He'd also struck many people as a slightly odd figure with his, at the time, quite extreme environmentalism and views on that. You know, the world has moved closer to him on that, and I think the country has also grown used to him, grown more fond of him. So I think he'll be in a better position in many ways than he would have been 20 years ago, just in terms of the personal affection for him. But clearly, in a kind of structural sense, there is something that the people who thought that it was a rather old-fashioned institution probably didn't particularly feel any animus for the Queen, and they didn't want to sort of rock the boat while she was still there. So I think you will certainly see Australia. I'm not close enough to the Canadian situation, but I was just recently in Australia, and there's a very widespread view that when the Queen died, that, you know, with some decent passage of time, they would move quite rapidly to become a republic. So I think you'll see that kind of structural change. That I'll probably have lots of Australians listening, phoning in, saying that's not true, but that's the expectation there, and it wouldn't be unreasonable after all this time. But you know, the links between Australia and Britain are not the same as they were 50 years ago. But I think he'll even if he's still quite, even if he comes in quite popular in the UK, there potentially will be that structural change in the Commonwealth to deal with, as well as you say, the fact that, you know, we're a modern country, and are we really going to have him and his son still play the same kind of role?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Stephanie, you said that there's this feeling that she was the one source of unity. And indeed, you know, just having Kriti Gupta in our studio, who one of her theses in college was on the royal family. She went to the Platinum Jubilee. She said she goes to the UK every chance she can get. She described herself as a real Anglophile. The way that the royal family really drew people from around the world to the country, to me, was pretty remarkable. And there's an economic story there, too, of course, with the tourism and the money that comes in as a result. And I'm wondering if we potentially start to see that shift with King Charles.
You know, I was thinking about that. I cycle into the Bloomberg office several days a week, and I was cycling. Sometimes, if I'm sort of trying to skip the rush hour, I'm cycling in during the changing of the guard.
Wow.
And I'm always surprised by how many people are there, you know, on a normal Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock. The number of people, I assume mostly tourists, who are outside Buckingham Palace to watch that very kind of archaic ritual, which they carry on doing, presumably entirely for the tourists. And things like that, who knows whether that will be sustained. I mean, it's something, as John Orford was, I think, or Tim Carroll was saying recently, just now, it's something the British do very well. But I think some of that potentially could wane. As you say, it's enormously economically valuable, you know, as part of one of the attractions that brings so many tourists to London. As you worry about Britain's sort of economic future post-Brexit, with economic policies potentially now in the next few years that global investors are not too thrilled about, you know, it is definitely a concern.
Joining us now on the phone, too, in our conversation with Stephanie Flanders, is Bloomberg News Executive Editor for International Government, Rosalind Matheson. Joining us on the phone from London. Great to have you speaking with us. And when we reflect on Queen Elizabeth's soft power, sort of just the enormous relationships, wide-reaching relationships that she built up with leaders from around the world, talk to us about how significant that was in, you know, solidifying the UK on a global scale and keeping up those diplomatic relations in, again, a 70-year reign that oversaw war, that oversaw recession, that oversaw real geopolitical turmoil.
Well, certainly, I mean, in her younger years, she was a very, very rigorous traveller overseas. I remember as a young girl in Australia, and I will beg to differ with Stephanie, offline perhaps on the Republican question about Australia, but at least in the short term. But I remember when she visited and just how that moment where everyone's lining the streets and flags are going and people are just thinking this is a sort of this mysterious creature who come from afar to see us. And she really did sort of do the hard yards on the road with different countries. And she also did it at home. She was always very committed to a bunch of charitable projects. She was very busily turning up at everything and just being that face that people saw all the time. And when you contrast that, particularly in more recent years, with sort of the UK arguably withdrawing in some measures from the global stage, certainly from the EU itself, she remained that sort of that face that people still thought of as being the UK, very fondly thought of in America, a country which has been very sort of intrigued with the mystery of the royal family and the idea of princesses and queens, and certainly very well regarded there. So she did carry that aura of soft power around her, and the softening that happened in her in a way in her elder years. She started to poke fun at herself. She showed a much more human side of the royal family. She let that come in via her grandchildren and great-grandchildren also. And so she certainly did carry a lot of weight there that's going to be, it's going to be interesting to see how her son, the new king, can also take that over, because he doesn't have that kind of natural charisma that she carried on the global stage.
Well, Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about that, Stephanie Flanders, and the idea of the way that her popularity really changed in the last 20, 25 years?
Yeah, I mean, I do think she has retained her popularity, and as the monarchy has sort of ebbed and flowed, and different members of her family have got themselves into trouble, it is occasionally reflected on her, or she's potentially, you know, sounded a wrong note in sometimes when she's spoken about it or in the events that she's done. But by and large, I think there was a sort of unwritten rule that it was sort of the Queen was not fair game in most of the sort of tabloid back and forth over members of the royal family. They would step back from stop short of criticising her. Of course, the famous counter-example was what was perceived to be a sort of tin-eared response to the public mourning over the death of Princess Diana. But when you think across the whole 70 years, and even over the last 20 years, I think she managed to stay one step back from those travails. But of course, the fact that there have been always problems with Harry and Meghan and issues around Charles and some of the other sort of missteps in of course Prince Andrew, I think that has weakened the monarchy as an institution, even as she managed to rise above it.
And Roz, it's just watching this outpouring global support coming in the wake of the news of Queen Elizabeth's passing. U.S. President Joe Biden issuing a statement saying that the Queen, quote, defined an era. And when we think about what King Charles's reign will look like, and reflecting again on all the different international relationships that the Queen had built up over her 70 years on the throne, where does Charles stand in establishing those relationships? Obviously, he's been the heir apparent for decades now. Does that give him sort of a head start in establishing himself on the global stage to the extent that his mother was?
Well, as Stephanie was saying, that the Queen was sort of like somewhat managed to rise above some of these issues over the years. And the question is, can Charles do the same? Or has the monarchy, or will the monarchy really change in some fashion under his reign, and then later on perhaps even William and others? But some of the things that happened in previous decades in the royal family really resonated overseas. The sense of grief over the death of Princess Diana and the way that the royal family was perceived as handling that, as Stephanie noted, really sort of resonated offshore. And I think Charles probably will have a different kind of relationship with these countries as a result, even though he has sort of burnished his image in the public mind in more recent decades. He doesn't have that kind of natural warmth and affection that he's held in those countries. And also the question is that what is his role with these countries going forward? The Queen had that residual respect over many decades. He's starting in some ways from scratch, and are these countries really that interested in the same kind of relationship with him as the King, as they were with Queen Elizabeth? It's very obviously far too early to really say anything about that with certainty, but you can imagine that it will be a very different kind of relationship.
Stephanie, I want to move more toward what's happening domestically in the UK and the throne that Prince, now King Charles, will sit upon. Again, I want to go back to your comment that the Queen was this one source of unity, but she also oversaw the country throughout many perilous moments, throughout many transitions as well, a declining empire at the beginning. And then at the end, what King Charles will inherit, which includes an energy crisis, concerns about unity with many parts of the country, a United Kingdom that is no longer part of the European Union. What are your comments on that?
Yeah, I think that on that, she clearly did preside over the loss of empire, certainly the structural change from imperial years to Commonwealth, and some of the national sort of missteps and humiliations that went along with that. I mean, the Suez crisis for starters, but many ups and downs on that. But you look now, and you think of the rupture and sort of structural shift in our place in the world that Brexit represents. that we are not planting our flag with the European Union in the way we were, and have actually pursued quite an extreme version of Brexit. One could imagine a Brexit that would have still left us quite associated with the rest of Europe in the same way that that Norway and other members of the single market are. So that we have that to come. We're only just beginning to see the consequences for our trading relations and for our sort of geopolitical position. But the more fundamental thing, which we see almost daily in the disputes over the Northern Ireland Agreement with the European Union, is this question, as you suggest, of whether even the Union itself will stay together. You have obviously a leader, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, who has paid tribute to the Queen today, but is quite determined to have a referendum, another referendum on Scottish independence. That, I suspect, the Conservative Party, while in government, will continue to resist. But one that potentially they can't resist is a referendum on the future of Northern Ireland, because it is part of that Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Accord that President Biden has repeatedly said must be respected. That if a plurality in Northern Ireland is perceived to be supportive of reuniting with the south of Ireland, with the country of Ireland, they have to hold a so-called border poll. They have to hold a referendum on reuniting. So for many, that is the greater risk, or certainly the greater possibility that you would end up having Ireland be reunited as one of the very clear consequences of Brexit. And for any monarch to preside over that, let alone Prime Minister, will be quite a thing, and another moment where you feel that Britain's place in the world stage has just had a few more bits sort of chipped away at it. Becomes a narrower and narrower thing.
Bloomberg News executive editor, senior executive editor, for economics and government, Stephanie Flanders. Really appreciate you taking the time this evening for you. And then also a big thank you to Bloomberg News executive editor for international government, Rosalind Matheson, joining us on the phone from London, along with Stephanie Flanders. You are listening to special coverage of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II on Bloomberg Business Week. You're listening to us right now on SiriusXM, on our radio stations across the country, and on Bay State Radio in Boston, Bloomberg 106.1. We are about 10 minutes away from the close of U.S. equity trading on this Thursday afternoon. Quick check of the markets right now as we do count you down to the close. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is higher today by a little more than 0.2%. The S&P 500 higher by more than 0.2%, while the NASDAQ is higher by 0.1%. Katie, much of our conversation, of course, all of our conversation this afternoon, has really focused on our special coverage of the passing of Queen Elizabeth. But we can't forget that we are a program that also focuses on the markets, on the macro, on the micro. What were you watching today?
Well, we actually got a lot of macroeconomic data points to chew on. Of course, we had the European Central Bank raising interest rates by 75 basis points in unprecedented move. And then we also heard actually from Fed Chair Jerome Powell speaking at an event Thursday saying that we need to act now forthrightly, strongly as we have been doing on inflation, of course, and you are seeing that fuel a sell-off in bonds and particularly in short-dated treasury yields up about 6 basis points at the moment, Tim.
Yeah, the S&P 500 edging higher after this fluctuating day. You mentioned Fed Chair Jay Powell. He reprised his hawkish views from the Jackson Hole collaboration, or confab, I should say, back in August, saying that officials are strongly committed to their fight against inflation. Powell said that the central bank won't flinch in its efforts to curb inflation, quote, until the job is done. I want to bring right now in Francine Lacroix, who's Bloomberg television editor-at-large, joining us this afternoon, this evening. Francine, really great to have you join us on Bloomberg Business Week. You've been focusing your coverage over the last couple of hours and, of course, thinking about the Queen and her legacy throughout the day. What are your thoughts when it comes to her legacy?
I mean, what she represented, Tim and Katie, is actually unbelievable. I mean, she was really a figure of national pride. She was a symbol of stability. She was a symbol of continuity. And frankly, she was respected around the world. Now, she has governed for such a long time, but of course, This was not without controversies. For example, at the death of Diana, when she was seen as not loving and not warm enough. But in the last 15 to 20 years, she was loved by everyone. I mean, this is a queen, if you think about it. She was only 25 when she came to power. She went on to become Britain's longest reigning monarch. And through speaking to people on the street that, frankly, are walking in the streets like they're in a wake, I mean, the sadness that has taken over London is nothing to be snuffed at. You kind of just think about all the presidents that she's met in the United States. She met even Winston Churchill, and her own godfather was born in 1850. So it's absolutely amazing what she lived through. And, we'll see if her son, who takes over, who we know will also be called Charles III, because he could have chosen any other name, will give this country that kind of stability and I guess the love that she gave them for such a long time.
And Francine, walk us through the next 10 days. We know that the state funeral comes 10 days from now. What are the days until that look like?
Yeah, so legally, Katie, so Queen Elizabeth II, once she died, her firstborn, Charles, automatically became king. Now, because she died in Scotland at Balmoral, of course, there will be the procession of bringing her down to London. We haven't been told exactly what that will entail, but of course, we go into a 10-day mourning period. We know that there will be no government announcements. That could be problematic for the new prime minister, who's literally day 3 in her job, who has to also come up with a budget and deal with the cost of living crisis. Flags will fly at half-mast. I've seen many pictures of, for example, Buckingham Palace, but also elsewhere around the nation. Charles will then formally be proclaimed king. We know that the Queen's coffin will be returned to London. We don't really know if that will take 3 to 4 days. And then that will arrive at Westminster Hall. And then day 10 is when we have the state funeral at Westminster Abbey. It will be a national holiday and markets will be closed.
Francine, we've been talking a lot about the challenges that lay ahead, not just for the new prime minister, but also for the new king. Talk to us a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges. I mean, we just heard from Stephanie Flanders, and so many people throughout our program today, that the Queen was really this source of unity, this one source of unity that kept the country together through so many tumultuous times.
Absolutely. At the same time, of course, she didn't have a political role. So this was largely ceremonial. Of course, it's a constitutional role. But in all of her years of governing, despite leaks that were never really confirmed, we really didn't know what she thought about, politics. We know, we understand through accounts of people that were close to her, that she had a great sense of humor, that she would sometimes politically take other heads of state into, to task about some of the things that she disagreed with. We also know that she spoke in private with no one around, so no minutes were taken, no notes were taken weekly with the prime minister. Now, the challenge going forward, I guess, for King Charles III will be, first of all, he takes over at 73 years old. He is quite outspoken, not as outspoken as his father, but certainly he's also run a business called the Duchy of Cornwall, where they make sustainable products. He's a great champion of sustainability. And after 73 years, he'll have to really be careful on what he says, because by law, by the Constitution, he can't be seen politically in favor or against anything. The challenge will be keeping, as you just had a conversation about, keeping the union together. This will be, the one thing that the Queen would have wanted, and I'm sure that there's going to be political goodwill from all sides for the next couple of months, but then we'll see what Scotland and, of course, the leader there will want to do. And then the other thing that we can't forget is the Commonwealth. I mean, the Commonwealth is this group of 54 nations that had its origins in the British Empire. And, some in the Commonwealth have argued that they would be better served by a rotating head amongst members, reflecting more of the modern relationship that the states have with one another as equals, instead of having the monarch. So again, this is about, holding countries together, be it the Union or the Commonwealth.
Well, Francine, to that last point, the idea of Commonwealth disintegration, how big of a concern is that? How likely is that?
I mean, it's a concern for sure, but at the same time, a lot of people argue that the monarchy also has to adapt to, the world we live now. It's not necessarily a source of income. I think it's a source of prestige. This is one of the most important monarchies, actually, in the world, and they're much more integrated in the politics than, for example, some of the Nordic countries in Europe. So I'm sure the monarchy, or the firm, as some like to call it, is thinking about their legacy, and they have to be seen as being modern enough, maybe adaptable enough to, live and sustain the test of times without changing too much or losing any countries.
Francine, I'm wondering about the conversations that you're having with people around you this afternoon, this evening, and the way that, people within your community are reflecting on the life and legacy of the Queen.
First of all, what was surprising to me is a really outpouring of sadness. I mean, we spent 4 or 5 hours, and again, it's not out of the blue, because we've heard about, of course, her ill health. We've heard about preparations for a possible new coronation that could take even a year, and the planning of this for a very long time, and there were leaks for about 5, 6, even 7 years. But remember, it was only 3 days ago where we had a new prime minister, and we saw pictures of the Queen. So this came a little bit of a shock at midday, and the way it was announced is that we saw in the House of Commons, someone go up to the prime minister and others and whispering something in her ear. That's usually not a good news. And then there were rumors, and then we waited, for 4 or 5 hours. And those 4 or 5 hours were quite uncomfortable. I mean, I was going around kind of meeting sources, and everybody was worried. Everyone was checking their phone and say, will it happen tonight? Because the outpouring, I think, of love, and the citizens, I have to say, in the UK, feel somehow protected by the Queen, because she's been such a bastion of continuity, and because she's known world affairs for such a long time. So it's quite a strange, a strange moment at the moment.
Francine, really appreciate you taking the time and joining us tonight. That's Francine Lacroix, Bloomberg Television editor-at-large, joining us live from London. We are just a couple of minutes away from the market close here on this Thursday afternoon. Taking a look at how things are in the S&P 500. A lot to digest today, Katie. We did hear from Fed Chair Jay Powell, nothing too surprising. We got that ECB decision as well. The S&P 500, though, ending on a bit of strength, higher by 0.5% right now. We'll call that a full 0.5 percentage point. Don't go anywhere, though, because we're going to be joined by our friends at Bloomberg TV for our Beyond the Bell coverage. We'll take you beyond the bell and beyond. You're listening to Bloomberg.
Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And right now, we are about 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day here in the United States. Romaine Bostick, Caroline Hyde, Taylor Riggs, we're counting you down to the closing bell. And here to help take us beyond the bell, we welcome in Tim Stenovic here today, as well as Katie Greifeld in for Carol Massar. And we welcome our audiences across Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, as well as on YouTube to parse the crucial moments of the day. A lot of focus today, of course, on the passing of Queen Elizabeth, though we are going to focus a little bit here on what's happening in the markets. We did get some commentary a little bit earlier, Tim, from the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, as well as from the Fed Chair, Jay Powell, and they seem to reiterate, I think, what the market has at least tried to price in.
Yeah, not too surprising, at least in the equity market. Bond market making some moves as a result of that. But a choppy session in the S&P 500, though, ending on a bit of strength today. Can't also forget about that ECB decision that we got as well. So certainly a lot to digest.
A lot to digest, a lot of macroeconomic data points indeed. And like Tim mentioned, the bond market, you're seeing some buying in stocks into the close, still selling in bonds though, when you think about, again, Powell repeating his intention to continue to fight inflation. It seems like a 75 basis point hike in September is locked.
After we got that from the ECB today, right? So you're really, Caroline, seeing full front and center a global central bank story that is really sort of lifting up rates here.
And not just Jay Powell. Remember, we heard from Charles Evans as well, basically saying 75 basis points. That's kind of the consensus right now.
And that's why we saw another day of strength for the US dollar. Most currencies lower, is only the Swiss francs and the Canadian dollar that managed to rise versus the US.
Well, it's been a pretty interesting day here in U.S. markets. Not a whole lot of action or volume here. We were up, we were down. Looks like we're going to finish the day in the green pretty much across the board, despite the fact that we had some pretty steep losses earlier in the day. The Dow Jones Industrial Average going to finish higher by roughly 190 points as we wait for these numbers to settle. That amounts to about 0.6%. The S&P 500 also up about 0.7% or 26 points, while the NASDAQ going to finish higher by about 70 points or 0.6%. And the Russell 2000, Taylor, going to finish higher by roughly 0.8%, 14 points at 1846, Tim.
Taking a look under the hood of the S&P 500, 382 stocks moved higher. We saw 119 stocks move lower. Taylor, you know, we've been covering the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth II here throughout the past 2.5 hours on Bloomberg Radio. I know you've been doing the same on Bloomberg TV. I was really struck to see the New York Stock Exchange take a moment of silence in the trading day. I spent years working on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, broadcasting from there. There was not one time in my recollection where we had a moment of silence in the middle of the trading day to honor the life and legacy of someone. We did it quite a bit in the mornings or in the afternoons, mostly in the mornings, but this was pretty remarkable.
And if there's a time to do it, you could argue today was the day, as we really think about the life and the legacy and the path forward for the UK as well. So really well said, Tim, as we always navigate the balance between some of the politics, the life of Queen Elizabeth II, as well as some of the market action here as well, as we take a look at this. For our radio audience, of course, the sector best performers, the sector worst performers, there was actually some green on the screen here. Banks were a big outperformer. You're up about 2.7%. Otherwise, Katie, pretty risk on with semiconductors, hardware equipment, some of the other dividend financials as well. Those are up a little bit, about 1% or so on the day. Go down to the bottom of the screen, though, Katie. There were some losers here. Utilities, household products, food and beverage. You really got a sense of some of those classic staples, inflationary hedges, the underperformers on the day, off about 0.25%.
And if you take a look at some of the individual movers, it was pretty easy to find gainers. It was a risk-on session. I want to start with Regeneron, absolutely soaring today, up almost 19%. That's after some promising clinical trial data about its eye drug, working to prevent age-related degeneration, worked well in a higher dose in those trials. Analysts lifting their price targets as a result, lifting the stock as well. Moderna, too, sticking with the theme here, also having a good day. Of course, Moderna coming out and saying that annual U.S. sales of its COVID-19 shots could be nearly as high as $13 billion. That's, of course, after health officials are likely to recommend an annual booster. And I want to end on AMD. It was a good day for the chips, AMD included. You had Stifel come out and initiate coverage with a buy with a price target of $122, saying that AMD is the best bet out of the three major U.S. computer chip companies.
All right, you got the gainers, Katie. I'll go ahead and go with decliners. I'm keeping an eye on shares of Apple today. Ended up finishing the day down close to 1 full percentage point. This one day following the unveiling of the iPhone 14, that new $800 Apple Watch, updated AirPods, and more. By the way, you can, of course, pre-order that new iPhone 14 starting on Friday, which, of course, the company does each and every year to try to get into this quarter before the more important holiday quarter comes up. Also watching shares of American Eagle Outfitters.
Well, and we should point out, too, that, I mean, that they're actually selling this earlier than what they did in the past cycles by about, usually you don't actually get that sort of materialize until the first week of October. So by sort of front-running that by a couple of weeks, it'll be interesting to see how that changes the dynamic.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting about that, Romaine, is that the price didn't shift at all.
No.
For that, at least for the base model.
Right.
At a time when we're talking about supply chain constraints and costs for these companies going up. So you have to wonder what that ends up looking like to margins, right?
It's important, but we should also point out the last couple of times, or at least before the iPhone 13, you know, you got a charger and other accessories along with that. So you're paying extra.
You're really hating on the chargers.
I am. It's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine.
I got some extra cords that I'll throw your way. Okay?
Sure, great.
Don't worry. American Eagle Outfitters down 8.7%. It sunk to a 2-year low in today's session. Retailer posting second quarter profit that fell short of estimates. And then McCormick, this, remember, was a pandemic darling, of course, the spice and herb company hitting a 52-week low today. reporting disappointing preliminary third quarter results. It slashed its outlook also for a full year earnings and for sales, Caroline.
Yeah, and that had a big effect on other companies, Campbell Soup and the like. I'm thinking on the downward trajectory. Let's go to those soft commodities. Let's go to commodities in general at the moment, because, Tim, we do see mixed picture overall. We've had a story of dollar strength once again. That's all about the hawkish Federal Reserve. But we actually managed to see oil manage to rebound after what has been about a 6% sell-off of late. WTI crude now at $82.72. We had some mixed inventory data. Cushing, Oklahoma, still seeing a buildup of inventories, but in general, the inventories did build up overall over the week before, but maybe dialing back a little bit in Oklahoma. We're looking at the natural gas up 1.4%, a little bit of a reprieve after what has been some selling pressure on natural gas, both over in Europe, most focusedly, but also here in the US. I'm looking at what happened on the FX side of things, therefore. Canadian dollar, because we saw oil rise, loonie did actually strengthen somewhat, but really this is a story of King Dollar once again, a hawkish Federal Reserve, whether it be Jay Powell, whether it be Charles Evans, as you were mentioning, remain. This is a Federal Reserve that will see the course in terms of tackling inflation. The ECB, of course, 75 basis point rate hike. Nevertheless, we don't see it managing to win out versus King Dollar. And we're looking at sovereign bonds sell off across the board, particularly in Europe as well, Taylor.
You really saw a little bit of that here with price lower, yield higher, Caroline. When you think about really the two-year yield that's up 7 basis points, really a day that we're so focused on really all the central bank action. But again, further comments from the Cato Institute that did come from Mr. Chairman Jay Powell. Further out on the yield curve, they're rising about 5 to 6 basis points. So I guess maybe less of an inversion. Now only negative 19 basis points remain on that really key 2s-10s curve that we watch.
And we're still getting earnings out here. Some that are of significant importance here. Let's start off with DocuSign. Those shares higher by about 10% here in the after hours trading. Those 2Q numbers coming in slightly above estimates. 2Q adjusted EPS at 44 cents. The street was looking for 42 cents a share. Again, that's an adjusted basis. Revenue also coming in higher at $622 million versus a street consensus of $602. The company reiterating its full year forecast for revenue, 2.47 to 2.48. That's basically your range that they had given last quarter. They're sticking by that for now. We should also point out Zscaler are also reporting they're beating pretty much on their first 1Q adjusted numbers, both on EPS and revenue, and providing some interesting guidance going forward that is coming in above consensus. Those shares, guys, higher by about 6%.
Yeah, well, I'm digging into the press release from DocuSign to get some commentary from management. Indeed, we're getting a little bit. The company's interim CEO and board chair saying that they have a, quote, $50 billion market opportunity, an industry-leading digital agreement platform, strong market position, and an experienced leadership team. The company CEO says they have total confidence that our team will successfully deliver for all stakeholders.
And I think it's really interesting, you guys, sort of big picture, when we think about companies like DocuSign with, again, a loss per share. We'd really been focusing on this market that was not rewarding companies with profitability. This is a growth at a reasonable cost, not growth at any cost. And yet you see some interesting post-market reaction as well, even though maybe you would argue Jay Powell is trying to tighten up some of those financial conditions, maybe help us to refocus on some of those fundamentals.
These would like to, I mean, both of these companies really benefited during the pandemic, particularly DocuSign, and you look at a chart of DocuSign
was up
over the last
okay, pessimist.
It is, well, but
Here
it gives
I
you a
am.
sense of why you're getting a 10,
That's
11% bounce off of numbers that maybe still be a little bit tepid.
Yeah, and I think all of this is as we hear the clamor coming from the likes of Mike Wilson and other strategists out there that earnings are going to come under pressure, if not this particular earnings season as it draws to an end, but the further one when we see the margin pressure, when we see, of course, some of the overall macro impacts on these micro stories.
All right, well, that is going to do it for our cross-platform coverage. Much to talk about, much to think about, but we will be back at the same time, same place tomorrow for Beyond the Bell. It's weekdays at the U.S. market close. It's on Bloomberg TV, Bloomberg Radio, and on YouTube. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Tim Stanovic along with Katie Greifeld. Let's take a look back at the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth now. Here with that is Bloomberg's Guy Johnson.
Queen Elizabeth reigned over the mostly peaceful breakup of a British empire that once spanned the globe. She came to the throne in the aftermath of World War II, when Winston Churchill was still Prime Minister, and addressed the British people at her coronation in 1953.
I have, in sincerity, pledged myself to your service as so many of you are pledged to mine. Throughout all my life and with all my heart, I shall strive to be worthy of your trust.
Queen Elizabeth would go on to be the UK's longest reigning monarch and enjoyed popularity for much of her time at Buckingham Palace. However, her and the royal family came under criticism in 1997 for a somewhat muted response to the death of Princess Diana. That led the Queen to address the country on the eve of Diana's funeral.
No one who knew Diana will ever forget her. Millions of others who never met her, but felt they knew her, will remember her. I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death.
One of the biggest challenges for the Queen was the media's intense focus on the private lives of her family. There was the marriage of Prince Charles and Diana unravelling in the public eye, followed more recently by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's decision to give up their duties as members of the royal family. Markle, who is biracial, went on to discuss the royal family's reaction to the birth of her son in an interview with Oprah Winfrey.
The conversation of he won't be given security, he's not going to be given a title, and also concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born.
The interview prompted a rare public response from the Queen, who said the issues raised by the couple would be taken very seriously. The controversy came at a time when Queen Elizabeth had scaled back her royal duties, as William and Kate, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, took on more public roles. Prince Charles will succeed the Queen to the throne, but will inevitably have a much shorter reign. Queen Elizabeth became the UK's longest reigning monarch in 2015, when she surpassed the record held by Queen Victoria. In London, I'm Guy Johnson for Bloomberg Radio.
A big thank you to Bloomberg's Guy Johnson, taking a look back at the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth. We continue our special coverage on Bloomberg Business Week, on SiriusXM, on Bloomberg Radio across the country, and of course on YouTube as well. And a special thanks also to our listeners in Boston listening to us on Bay State, Bloomberg 106.1 this afternoon. We're very, very pleased right now to be joined by Mary McLeod, former policy advisor to Queen Elizabeth, also a former member of Parliament, joining us this evening on the phone from London. Mary, like I said, it is great to have you joining us this evening. You knew the Queen very well as policy advisor. Our condolences to you and to everybody across the country this evening after her passing. How would you describe her legacy?
Thank you, and it's good to speak to you this evening, although I wish it was under other circumstances. But yeah, I mean, for the United Kingdom, it's a real deep sense of loss across the country, because she seemed to touch the entire country, and it will leave a gaping hole in the heart of the nation. And naturally, our thoughts and prayers are with her immediate family. And I think our new king put it beautifully today: moment of great sadness for her family, cherished and much loved. A beloved mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. So, her legacy is really, really strong. And our most recent Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who only saw the Queen 2 days ago at Balmoral, said she was the rock on which modern Britain was built. And I think that is so true. I mean, she served the country for 70 years, earning respect, admiration, and love of all the people that she met. And I just think personally also she was a real inspiration. I mean, as a woman, I grew up thinking I could achieve anything. There was a female monarch, a female prime minister, and I just felt that she set that sort of tone. But I think with her, the fact of her devoting her life to service, a real selfless leader, but it's also her humility, dignity, the kindness she showed to people, no matter who they were, the dedication, the wisdom that she had for difficult situations, her thoughtfulness, and her humour. She had a great sense of humour, but the strong values she held and that sense of duty that was prevalent in everything she did, and a real interest in every single person that she spoke to. When you spoke to the Queen, you literally felt you were the only person in the room, that she was listening to every word you said. And she did, because she, after events and people that she met,
she would come back and talk to them, talk about what she'd heard or the stories that had happened during that day over dinner that evening. So she really, I think, touched hearts around the world. And she's been on the throne, yes, for 70 years, but I guess we also saw her as a child when her father, George V, came to the throne in 1936. So almost everyone who's alive today has known of the Queen. And I think in the US, our strongest friend and Britain's greatest ally, the Queen met almost every US president over the last 70 years. It's an incredible history.
Yeah, I believe it's 13 of 14 presidents, Mary.
Yes, exactly. So it's, and it was really touching and much appreciated to see the American flag at the half-mast today, and just the really, I think it shows how much her reach went globally, and that people really felt that she had, and just her example to all of us was a real inspiration.
And Mary, to your point, her wide-reaching relationships with international leaders, like Tim said, 13 of 14 U.S. presidents. When we think about where the country goes from here, where the new King Charles goes from here, I'm going to recycle a question I asked to our Bloomberg colleagues in the previous hour. Is King Charles starting from scratch in building those relationships, or does the decades lead up to this moment, him becoming king, give him a bit of a head start?
Well, and Tim was right to point out the number of US presidents, because it just shows the history and the people and she has such a retention of knowledge and of that history, that she was just amazing to be sit around the table with and have a conversation with, because she brought all that knowledge with her. But in terms of for the UK now, Katie, I think naturally there'll be a period of mourning, but she was in essence our strength and stay, and therefore that will, I think, carry people through that, just the memory of that, and it crossed all generations. Even although she was 96, it definitely crossed all generations. And we will get to a point of celebrating her life and legacy too, because it's of who she was and what she was around the world and across the Commonwealth. But we saw that in the recent Platinum Jubilee celebration. But this is the end of our sort of second Elizabethan age, and so it will be a new era. And I think what the palace has done over the course of certainly the recent year, but probably 2-3 years, is there has been a sort of slow transition where the other members of the royal family have stepped up and done more with her or instead of her, and so our new king has been King Charles III has had years now, decades of experience of following in her footsteps, and has learned from the best.
Mary,
therefore, I think that transition will be easier than we might have thought.
Mary, I'm just really eager to hear about the work that you did with the Queen as former policy advisor. You were a member of Parliament until 2015, and then after that position, you became a policy advisor to the Queen. What specifically did you work on with her, and what was it like?
Well, I stood for Parliament first, then became her policy advisor, and then became a member of Parliament. But it was I went in to help the royal family at the time to look at how the royal family should change, what they should do differently, and advise the Queen on key areas of national life. So it was a very open remit, a strategic role that was about how does the Queen and the royal family adapt and change to the times we live in. The Queen was very wise, and she absolutely knew and understood that you can't stand still, you can't be the same forever, and therefore you have to adapt over time. Any organisation and any leader has to do that. And she certainly would listen, and she definitely had a point of view, but it was very much, it was about duty, and it was a sense that the people needed this, and this was important for the country. She would absolutely do that. But that ability to adapt and change over time is what we have seen, and it just shows the wisdom that she has shown in so many situations which have been difficult, but yet she continues to be that strength and stay for every generation as it happens.
And Mary, of course, King Charles, in the wake of Queen Elizabeth's passing, is taking over at a real period of tumult for the UK economy. Of course, the UK welcoming a new monarch and a new prime minister just in the span of days is a remarkable moment. What would you say to King Charles right now? What advice would you give to him as he prepares to take over?
I mean, you're right, Katie, about the moment in time. I mean, this is such an immense week of change for the UK. But I don't think I need to give the new king any advice because he has had the best possible example of his mother that he has worked with throughout his time as Prince of Wales, and now, of course, as the new king. So I think it's just live as she lived and do as she did. And then, there are big shoes to fill, but I'm absolutely sure that he has done so much already and there's so many projects that he has been involved in that he will absolutely rise to the challenge of that. And the uncertainty that we have in the United Kingdom, there's a moment, there's this uncertainty across the world. We're living in very difficult times. And that's where I think the relationships that we have with, of course, yourself in the US and others around the world, we all support each other and help each other through the difficult moments, and of course celebrate with in the times where we can have hope again and turn things around. So I'm very hopeful for the future, and I think the new king will have, as I say, an amazing inspiration with his mother to just look at for her wisdom and example.
There's also the question, though, Mary, of what the monarchy looks like and the role of the monarchy over the next 70 years. We saw what it looked like over the last 70 years under Queen Elizabeth, but times have changed, and there's not widespread agreement necessarily on the role of the monarchy within the country. How do you see Prince, now King Charles, navigating that, and what does that look like?
Yes, well, it's difficult to look at the future and really know what that might look like. But, I think the monarchy in the UK is still very strong. And I think that we'll see, and we're already seeing it, the outpouring of love and loss that people are feeling right now. And I think the now king has been by the Queen's side more and more over recent years, supporting and helping and doing everything right to help her do her role as monarch and queen. And so therefore, I think that makes that transition a bit easier. And I think the role of the monarchy in Britain will continue. There's a really strong support for it right now. At times, people will question things, but I think having that example still that we all remember of how important role the Queen had, I think we'll translate that to the new king as well. And of course, the nice thing, I guess, that the Queen always had was that she was head of state, yes, but on a day-to-day basis, the Prime Minister had the difficult task of running the country, but of course, the Prime Minister always sees the monarch on a weekly basis, and those are really important, useful sessions where, again, there's advice probably going both ways.
Yeah. Hey, Mary, really appreciate you taking the time tonight and joining us. That's Mary McLeod, former policy advisor to Queen Elizabeth, also a former member of Parliament, joining us this evening on the phone from London. Let's stick in London right now, and I'm very pleased this evening to bring in our Bloomberg Quick Take correspondent, Alex Webb, who joins us on the phone from London. Alex, good to have you with us this evening. First of all, as I've been asking everybody who's on the ground in London, just give us an idea of what things are like. What are the conversations that you're having with your friends, with your family?
So actually, the news broke this evening, and my mother happens to be visiting, and she's someone who was born in 1949 and remembers the Queen's coronation. And she had a real crack in her throat, and I thought she was about to cry when the news broke, because she has a vague recollection of her predecessor, but the Queen was bookended her entire life, and well, hopefully not bookended, because I hope my mother's not going anywhere soon. But you know, it is something. It has been a constant in all of our lives. And when Tony Blair described her as the matriarch of our nation, I think that is absolutely true, and does leave us somehow feeling a little bit rudderless.
It's a great point, and the stat was in one of the many Bloomberg News articles, but I believe it's 85% of the UK population hasn't known anything other than Queen Elizabeth. It's a great point. She took over the throne in 1952, 70 years ago. Just outstanding figure there. But Alex, talk to us sort of about the relationship between the monarchy and what the constitutional role actually is, because it's been said time and time again that, you know, the Queen, for all intents and purposes, was a figurehead, but she did have a role to play.
Yeah, her role is very much a supra-political one. She's above politics and a sort of steadying influence behind the scenes. You know, in those 52 years, or in those 70 years since 1952, she has been the monarch for the sovereign for 15 prime ministers, you know, with a steadying hand behind the scenes. But for Britain as a nation, that does have significance, because she is essentially the embodiment of the state. She is the head of state. If you have a prime minister whose popularity, both at home and abroad, might be questionable, they are not the person who is synonymous with the nation. That is different from the US, where the president, of course, is a political figure. And if there is a president who is not popular abroad particularly, that has implications for the US's popularity as a whole. It is not the same in the UK, because we've had this constant figure. Now, as long as it's been the Queen, that has been a positive. As we move forward, Prince Charles has evolved, and now garners a great deal more respect than he might have done 25 or 30 years ago. But he now has to forge that same sense of responsibility and garner the respect that the Queen has managed to do over the course of her reign.
Alex, I want to get a bit personal here, so excuse me. You shared a story about your mother and the way that she felt, but I'm really curious about the way that you and your age demographic and, you know, your friends and your family are thinking about this. You know, because you and I are about the same age, and I know.
How old is that, would you say?
I would say, you know, we're millennials.
Okay,
I would go ahead and say that. Alex is a
slap bang in the middle of the millennials. Yeah,
exactly. And Alex is a new father too. And I think earlier in the program we got the stat that 85% of people who live in the UK were not alive during any other monarch. So, you know, she's been present your entire life. But is there a difference in the way that a younger generation feels about the role of the monarchy in the UK? And I know that I'm asking you to paint with a broad brush here, but generalize for us, if you will.
I mean, I think it is undeniable that, you know, over the course of her reign, the fervor for the monarchy has waned. But it is still a majority of the population that is in favor of the monarchy. And, you know, for someone like me, my life has been punctuated at various stages by, you know, huge royal events. You know, earlier memories of, you know, I have a very firm memory of the day Princess Diana died and where I was and of the funeral. And then I remember the various weddings of you know, Edward, the Count of Wessex and Sophie, and Prince Charles' second wedding, of course, to Camilla Parker Bowles. You know, more recent years than Harry and William and their respective brides. Those are tentpole events. Of course, in addition to that, the Jubilees, they're tentpole events that are, you know, in some ways, are the background contours of many of our lives, and we take a lot of it for granted. We have taken the Queen and her reign for granted as a constant. So perhaps, you know, there is not the questioning in our generation, but there's also not the fervor that there might have been in earlier generations.
I mean, it's incredible. Tim, you and I were talking last week, I think it was. One of my earliest memories is Princess Diana's funeral. That was really...
1997.
It was not 1996, I believe.
It was 97, yeah, exactly.
97. Okay, I was a late bloomer. But Alex, we're not meeting a new person in King Charles. Prince Charles, now King Charles. The Queen really was a beloved figure. And again, I'm asking you to speak personally here. What is the sort of feeling towards King Charles as he steps into this role?
Well, it's a strange thing because he's actually the oldest monarch ever to accede to the throne. He's well into his 70s. But he is someone who has very much evolved. It's interesting. He's not of the same generation, of course, as the Queen is. Someone who was raised, the Queen came of age during the war, during rationing, and had lived a very sort of frugal lifestyle, in fact, of a kind of minor, when she was at her happiest in Balmoral, almost living as minor Scottish gentry.
Wow.
Prince Charles does kind of inhabit more the kind of benefits of being a royal. He travels with his own bed in advance, for instance. But he has been remarkably astute on calling very big and important issues. Stuff like global climate change, which he was talking about way back in the 1970s. He really does care about humanitarian issues and has been very forthright on a lot of them. Now, that has been positive. He's been a positive advocate for a lot of things. But if we return to this original idea that the monarch is supposed to be super political, above politics, he has sometimes got in hot water for playing more of a hands-on political role. So striking that balance is, I think, something he's perhaps improved at over the years, but now he is very, of course, front and center, and it will be, a lot of people will be following with great interest how he manages that change.
One of our guests this afternoon made the point to say that Queen Elizabeth was above the politics of all that. You never knew what she was thinking. We'll never know what she thought about Brexit, for example, is one of the examples that one of our guests gave. Alex, what about the environment in the UK right now? And also the environment, look, in Europe, it's one that we're seeing where inflation is high, energy costs are going up. There's a new prime minister who's planning to cap energy prices for the next 2 years in terms of heating. I know that the monarch is not political per se, but still there is this element of unification. And still, they are a leader to a certain extent. How does King Charles navigate that?
One hopes that it becomes a reason to bring the nation together rather than to divide us further. You could say that now it's the winter of our discontent. I don't want to be too pretentious and borrow from Shakespeare, but there are a lot of things going on right now between the ongoing fallout from Brexit, of course, the cost of living crisis, which energy prices in the UK seem to be accelerating more than in some of our neighbouring countries, and perhaps politically, I'm intrigued to see what this means for Liz Truss, our Prime Minister of little more than 3 days, whether this perhaps in fact gives her some cover to do these behind the scenes while the nation focuses on the Queen's funeral and the subsequent coronation of Prince Charles. But when you think about national mood, it'll be very interesting to see what the markets do tomorrow, because I do wonder whether consumer sentiment, all these underlying factors do get affected by this sort of thing. But I do hope that it really pulls the nation together in a kind of sense of national unity, which is much overdue.
And that unity, this moment of unity, definitely seems to be taking hold. Again, we're looking at pictures and images and video from outside Buckingham Palace. But Alex, again, I want to get personal here because you do have a unique perspective. When you think about the relevancy of the monarchy and the popularity of the monarchy, we've heard time and time again over the past 2.5 hours that, again, Queen Elizabeth was a beloved figure that in a lot of ways, people